stand there, please. Good evening. I know you all complained about the cold winter, so we made sure you'd be warm this evening. But I'm sure you'll find that it is well worth it to come in from the nice weather outside and hear a speaker of this quality. I'm Frank Sisson from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, director of the Petro Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research. This evening's event is sponsored by the St. Vladimir Institute, by the Ukrainian Canadian Documentation and Research Center. I always have to try make sure if I get all of those initials correctly, and by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Olga Bertelsen. She is this year the Petro Yatsik postdoc at the University of Toronto at the Munk Center. The Yatsik postdoc brings to the University of Toronto yearly a young scholar, soon after PhD, and gives that scholar an opportunity to use the research resources of Toronto. And the students of the University of Toronto are given the opportunity to take a course from the Yatsik postdoc. I think it's fair to say that the Yatsik postdocs have contributed greatly not only to the university community, but to the more general community by the number of lectures they have given. But I think already the champion of these lectures and activities is Dr. Bertelsen. That is, she has been tremendously active this year in addressing many publics on many, many topics. And that is because she has a vast array of knowledge in her research and array of research topics, and a varied background. That is, she started life with a real profession. That is, she finished stomatologia. She was a dentist in Ukraine. Something that many Ukrainian mothers we know dream that their sons and now daughters should do on the way to their career. However, her relocation to North America brought the great benefits for Ukrainian scholarship. And she comes with a very interesting background. She comes from the city of Kharkiv, and she actually was born in the building, the budinnik of the Ukrainian writers in Kharkiv. That is, this is the very building in the 1920s where all of the members of the great renaissance of Ukrainian culture lived, and of course where in the 1930s so many of them were destroyed. So she brings really quite an interesting personal experience through her father and family and through her residence in Kharkiv. Now, that is, I think, the background to why we understand the region we will hear about today, and as well some of her understanding of what the 1930s brought to Ukrainian culture, and at that time until 1934, the Ukrainian capital. She has a BA from Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania. She attended Penn State University for graduate courses, and a PhD from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. She has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute in Columbia, and next year I'm pleased to say she will be the Yatsik visiting fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. She'll be returning to Columbia, but in this case, in the Yatsik Ukrainian program. And I think it shows the excellence of her research and certainly her ability to write applications well that has brought her these successes. Now, I say she has a very varied background because she is a historian, and she places great attention to archives and archival research, and she has shown great industriousness, as you will hear this evening, to do social history, and particularly to study what might be called from below society. Involves in tremendous going over of materials. But she not only specializes in looking at historical periods, but she's been quite active in both her teaching and her lectures at discussing current political situations, particularly with the Russian-Ukrainian confrontation, She has been a major voice speaking out for understanding of Ukraine and I think understanding of Russia in the deeper sense. Her own writings consist of a volume on Les Courbas in Teatr Berezil, on the basis of archival documents that are coming out with Smolosky Press in Ukraine. She has written a monograph on the politics of silence, Russian and Ukrainian political and cultural encounters, 1919 to 1991. And she has done very interesting research on spatial dimensions of Soviet repressions of the 1930s, the House of Writers, Kharkiv, Ukraine, therefore bringing her close personal experience of a building to this study of the past. This evening she will be speaking to us on a social history of the Holodomor, Voices from Kharkiv Oblast, 1926 to 1934. Please greet Dr. Bertelsen.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. It's just a wonderful day, and I didn't expect that so many of you will come because, you know, people are involved in all kinds of activities during this wonderful period of time, April, May. Thank you very much, Dr. Sissin, for this introduction. I was thinking, is it all me? But just thank you. It's an honor for me to be here today and to share with you some thoughts about my research on the Holodomor. And I'm very grateful to actually three organizations or three institutions for the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, and now I will mention this also, this institution several times in my presentation because I have reasons for that, and of course the St. Vladimir Institute for the invitation. Approximately I think 20 years ago, I had a conversation with a woman who survived the Holodomor in the Kharkiv Oblast. She was an old woman. She's not around any longer, but she shared with me her story of survival. And she was a student in the early 30s. She was a student in Kharkiv, and she came from a village. And she told me that by February 1933, she shared a room with another student, and she was a young girl also. They were about 16 maybe. And by February 1933, they hadn't had any food for a month approximately. And they didn't have any energy to go out, so they decided to stay, just to preserve some kind of energy, to stay within their apartment. They were prepared to die. I will make some phrase for my water because it's just too dry. They were prepared to die, and a friend of her brought a carrot, a little carrot. It was just almost rotten, brown. And she apologized. She said, maybe it will help you survive. She apologized for this gift. And she put this carrot on the table for her. And she's telling this story. And she said, I wanted desperately to eat it, desperately. But I couldn't do this. I wanted, and I couldn't do this because I felt that I would betray my friend, who was in a much worse condition. So what she decided, she told me, what she decided to do, she said, to prolong my life a little bit, I decided not to touch it. This carrot was on the table, and I decided not to touch it for maybe as long as I can. Maybe it will prolong my life, and maybe I will share this carrot with my friend. And there, this carrot stayed on the table for a day, for 2 days, for 8 days, and she faced this moral dilemma. And I believe during the Holodomor, all people faced moral dilemmas, multiple moral dilemmas. They were doomed to choose. And every choice entailed an irreparable loss, I would say, and moral dilemmas. And the tragedy was not that they were starving. They ceased, perhaps many of them ceased to understand of what it is to be human. The notions of responsibility or guilt, of right and wrong, became vague and obscure for many of them. And moreover, those who survived the experience were so deeply wounded that they were simply frightened to wish to return to the, I would say, to the traffic of normal life. In addition, they were filled with moral indignation against the false value and the values and the repellent moral codes of their society that made them suffer and let their relatives die like animals. So I believe there is profound disagreement among historians about moral issues. Should historians discuss them or make them a centerpiece of their research? Should we dance around and analyze maybe some kind of historical event without touching any moral issues, or without keeping in mind some sort of moral point of departure? How to preserve a degree of humility in order not to fall into this abyss of moralizing? We all remember, of course, Machiavelli, for instance, and he uncovered the uncomfortable truth and I would say, the cynicism of politics. And he didn't seem to worry about his interpretation of politics being anti-humanist or cruel, but it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that he, Machiavelli, was kind of immoral or cynical. Later, many years later, the British historian, he was a historian and he was a philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, he has argued it upset those who came after Machiavelli and were not prepared to abandon their own, perhaps, moral values together with the entire way of thought and action of which they were a part. And in my view, morality and moral values should be at the core of any scientific inquiry. Then it is an implicit invitation to my readers to make a choice and to approach the truth of historical events and realities, which is grounded in their own moral values and perceptions. And that's what is valuable, I think, in any final analysis, our commitment to better understanding of humankind and, after all, of ourselves. One might argue that the Holodomor is one of the most researched topics in the Ukrainian history, which is true. I agree with this. Some scholars believe that this topic is increasingly sterile, and there is nothing new can be added or contributed by scholars. I disagree with this. A social history of the Holodomor has not been written yet, and we still know little about people who suffered, who died in 1932-33, and those, of course, who survived. Who were they? What did the famine do to them? How did they raise their children? This is a very good question. In conformity to the authorities or in compliance with their policies, what helped them survive? How did the famine shape their social behavior and psyche? Finding the answers to these very difficult questions, I think, is crucial. Thanks to studies of many studies, and for instance, by scholars such as Oleg Bertelsen, we have a better idea about, for instance, demographics, right? How the Holodomor changed the demographics of Ukraine. I hope my study will help better understand maybe the psychological demographics of Ukraine, of contemporary Ukraine, a society that was characterized by James Mays as a post-genocidal society. What I would like to do today is to perhaps briefly discuss my major argument of this particular study, the methodology of this study, the sources that I used for this study. And for the sake of time, there are a lot of themes that I discuss. within this book. It's just a larger project, it's a book project. There are a lot of themes, but for the sake of time, I'll talk about only two themes which I think are kind of have been overlooked in the discussions of the Holodomor: the role of Taras Shevchenko and his poetry, and the role of Gorilka, vodka, alcohol in people's survival. They are very interesting, these themes, and I think not many scholars have written about this. And I will also briefly talk about the experiences of various people in the Kharkiv Oblast. On the basis of these archival materials that I had an opportunity to study, I will talk a little bit about women, a little bit about children, the elderly, the men who experienced the Holodomor. And I will share probably at the end some preliminary conclusions and say a couple of words about the significance of the study as I understand it. As we all know, in the late 20s, early 30s, a fundamental demographic and psychological rupture occurred in Ukraine, which disrupted the continuity of national cultural traditions among the Ukrainian peasantry. And scholarship on the Holodomor has emphasized the detrimental effect of the famine on human behavior, social conduct, mentality, moral values, and human character. Prolonged food deprivation lasted for many in Ukraine from 1928 to 1934 at least, and I believe it's just a mistake to think that people began to starve in 1932. This deprivation determined and reinforced people's behavior and social patterns. But it would be fair to say that only at the peak of the famine in 1932-33, the peasants' behavior severely departed from some sort of conventional norms, and to the point, I would say, of psychotic reactions and abnormal behavior such as cannibalism. In other words, the distance between the moral and the immoral slowly, gradually withered away for many. The focus of my study, as I mentioned, is people's social behavior and tactics of survival in the Kharkiv Oblast, in rural areas actually of the Kharkiv Oblast, one of the areas in Ukraine most affected by the famine. And people's voices highlight their attitudes toward power and freedom, and reflect their moral and ethical values, in which national sentiment, I think, played a significant role. And this sentiment was sustained and perpetuated by what? By state violence, and by, I would argue, the aesthetic spirit of the nation, which was embodied in the artistic work of its spiritual leaders, such as Taras Shevchenko. Their voices recovered from archival documents confirm Abraham Maslow's theory, and he was writing about the hierarchy of human needs. Food a top priority and a vital human need that defines human behavior, powerfully reinforced immorality and fear during periods of deprivation. People's testimonies allow us to capture some of their individual experience, and I would say collective experience also. And their responses to the famine suggest that in acquiring the skills of survival, the majority, I'm not saying all of them, but the majority surrendered their ideals of freedom, again, on individual and collective levels, which ultimately contributed to the moral and intellectual foundation of contemporary Ukrainian society. What methodology did I use? What sources did I study? Actually, conceptually, I tried to study a lot of works that have been written on this topic, on how calamities such as famines influence people and people's behavior. And we have quite a few of these studies written by Abraham Maslow that I mentioned earlier, Peterim Sorokin, Eric Fromm, Sergei Maksudov, and a couple of Ukrainian scholars, Olesya Stasyuk and Mikhailo Kosyev, and other people contributed to this particular theme. The multiple accounts of those who were exposed to starvation have demonstrated that their antisocial behavior was provoked by the absence of food, and these studies are based on people's accounts, actually, and perhaps more so by the uncertainty of being able to procure food in the future, tomorrow, in a month, and later. So, in other words, the loss of hope, in my opinion, produced a certain mental state when moral borders seemed unclear and even unnecessary to them. Precisely the feeling of uncertainty was detrimental to people, erasing the last glimpses of perhaps conscience and morality. Importantly, the direct result of behavioral change in people who were exposed to prolonged starvation was a change in their identity. And these people who I just mentioned earlier, the scholars were writing about this. The integrity of the self suffers, and as Sorokin has suggested, the self-identification becomes amorphous and split into perhaps two or more selves, often at war with one another. So on a collective level, the most drastic change occurred with people's willingness to surrender their freedom. Food deprivation and the threat of death paralyzed people's will to freedom, free speech, and intellectual activities uncensored by the state, and slavery appeared to them a more attractive development than death. Struggle for their freedom became physically and mentally impossible for them. The state's food monopoly forced people to sacrifice their freedom for the sake of survival. These scholars also emphasized that antisocial conduct, cruelty, and even sadism becomes a part of the cultural landscape in the sites of starvation. The social ties within the families are weakened and broken, and altruism, humanism, and self-sacrifice, typical actually human phenomena in calamity-free times, evaporate and are replaced by extreme egocentrism and even animalistic behavior. Pathological greed for food and for possessions that can be exchanged for food develops at the peak of the famine. Immoral behavior such as denunciation, lying, stealing, robbing mark everyday activities of almost all individuals who suffer from hunger. And this is a very important point that I would like to make here. During the Holodomor, moral corruption and intellectual deterioration were accelerated by the virtual absence of cultural aesthetic artifacts because they were gone, they were expropriated. The material culture of the peasant household represented by, prior to this moment, prior to 1932-33, for instance, by icons, by embroidery and wooden crafts, ceased to exist. The objects of national art were also sold or exchanged for foodstuffs, creating a culturally empty environment in which the peasant's eye could no longer enjoy some kind of beauty, a product of aesthetic value and beauty. At the peak of the famine, cannibalism becomes a widespread and inseparable actually part of human experience. This authors also discuss this theme, and demoralized and deranged individuals can no longer decipher the shades of disgust or repulsion. With time, consuming human flesh becomes, I would say, a casual affair. And for many individuals who are near death, and they feel no pangs of conscience for the professional ambushing, killing, and eating of passers-by, as Sorokin was writing. And by the way, I have to thank the Documentation Center because it helped me find a very interesting document, a memoir, just a second, a memoir which was written by a woman. She is a Polish Jew. She was sentenced to, I don't remember, to 10 years, and she spent she was there for quite some time. She met in one of the camps in the Gulag 300, at least she's talking about this, 300 Ukrainian women cannibals who was sentenced also to this particular camp for this particular transgression. Another part of my research is the archival part, and of course I examined studied a lot of archival materials for a number of years, and among them, of course, letters of complaint, proclamations, and memoirs. Most of these documents, I recovered them in the State Archive of Kharkiv Oblast, Dacho. Most of them came from this particular archive. And what was important to me, of course, the dates, because you have to know when they were written. It is very important. The content, I paid attention to the content, of course, and it was very important to understand the context in which they were written. People's loss of faith in the Soviet system, prolonged starvation, and difficult psychological state actually emboldened them to write letters of complaint to Selyrady, to local party organs, to newspapers, and even to Stalin. I saw all of them, of what I could find there. Materials used by, and it's a very interesting point that I would like to make here, materials used by the peasantry for their letters of complaint reveal the absolute misery of the material culture in the countryside. They were written on pieces of wallpaper and accounting forms, on pages from school notebooks, and even on the margins of newspapers or the backside of propaganda leaflets. And of course, I use the methods of oral history because over the years I had an opportunity to talk to many people who survived the Holodomor in the Kharkiv Oblast. So now let me move to another topic, or two themes that I mentioned earlier, the role of Taras Shevchenko and his poetry, and the role of gorilka, vodka, alcohol in people's survival. It is actually amazing that Shevchenko's poetry is mentioned in many, many letters of complaint, proclamations, and memoirs. And I believe Shevchenko and his poetry occupied a very special place in the imagination of Ukrainians. It appears that especially at the moment of crisis, including the famine, his poems became perhaps an embodiment of the nation's soil that galvanized people's resistance and helped them survive. Another woman told me that she believed, it was just of course many, many years later that she revealed this story to me, but she said, I had kabzar, and I was reading this kabzar on a regular basis when I didn't have any food, and she sincerely believed that kabzar helped her survive. Believe it or not, but perhaps her memory is obscured. Who knows? But that's what she claims. I found this very interesting. Perhaps also, I would say it is so because Shevchenko's literary expression and conviction, which captured the preceding Ukrainian literary tradition of depicting Ukraine as a victim, and which are associated with Shevchenko's sharp feeling of a crisis and his tragic, even, I would say, apocalyptic perception of reality, were somehow internalized and utilized by the peasants as a last resort of comfort. And I think this particular feature is very important to understand who Shevchenko was, and of course, perhaps that's what he meant for these people, a person a person with some kind of tragic perception of reality. Perhaps this was the most important factor for them. Quite possibly, Shevchenko's ability to speak the language of people that revealed their moral values and aspirations became crucial for those who heard nothing but Bolshevik propaganda. Being deeply psychological, Shevchenko's poetry penetrated I think, the depths of people's psyche, calling them to action. And the poet's line, "Bury me and arise, break your chains, поховайте та вставайте, кайдани порвіте," from his poem My Testament, Заповіт, was included in many proclamations that I saw. studied in the archives, displaying the degree of national and political awareness and the determination to destroy Bolshevism in their villages. Another theme, alcohol. Or Zelený Zmi, that's how people refer to this particular substance in their letters of complaint. In Ukrainian villages, horilka became an anesthetic and a tranquilizer, if you will, during times of hardship and the famine, and its unlimited consumption was a way, I think, of alleviating depression and fear. Also, in the virtual absence of any foodstuffs, it was understandably a wonderful source of calories and a replacement of energy sources such as bread and potato. Horilka fulfilled multiple functions and served various purposes. It was used to enhance individual power over people. Alcohol was also a means of bribery. As bizarre as it may seem, in 1932-33, the time of crisis and mass deaths, hedonism was a motivational factor for alcohol consumption among the leadership of Selorady and Kolhozpe. Horilka was certainly a currency for villages as good as bread. According to a 1930s study that I found in the Korolenko library, in the Kharkiv, approximately 70% of the peasants secretly prepared home-brewed beverages. I don't know how reliable this data is, but at least there is some study that claims that a lot of people did this. Where did they find grain or some source of? It's another question. It's a very good question. I cannot answer this question, but the study exists. Some villages, and I call them entrepreneurs, managed to establish reliable channels for delivery of horilka. Imagine that, to sell in Leningrad at the peak of the famine. And final alcoholism among the Ukrainian peasants was also blamed for mass deaths in 1932-33. It was not only a convenient way for the authorities to conceal the famine and mass deaths in the countryside, but also helped the state avoid its responsibilities to pay the relatives of the deceased an insurance compensation. Believe it or not, some peasants were insured. So it was just a discovery for me. Interestingly enough, when I read these documents, I didn't know this. Interestingly enough, in 1930, Stalin pushed for greater production of alcoholic beverages in Ukraine, and despite the 1928 anti-alcohol campaign launched by the Soviet authorities, horilka, vodka, became available in plenty in each village store. Сільпо. For the Kharkiv Oblast, the distribution pattern of the amount of alcohol increased up to 25%. Ethanol factories, spirtzavody in Ukraine began to work at their full capacity. Not much has been written about this particular theme, and I found only one study written by an American by the American scholar Kate Tranchell, and this is a study about some kind of drinking culture in Russia. And she has noted that alcohol had tremendous fiscal importance to the state, but she also, it's an interesting fact or finding, because her study is based on archival documents also. She found them in Moscow. She also provided archival evidence for an official opinion which emanated from Moscow that, please pay attention to this, it's a quote, supplying Ukraine with large amounts of cheaper state alcohol would not only help with the Samagon problem there, but might also pacify a population growing restive over collectivization and decreasing food supplies. So someone in the Kremlin uttered this, stated. Who knows? Maybe the recent, by the way, decision in Moscow to reduce the price of vodka, the decision by Putin's regime is also made to pacify the growing discontent in the Russian society. Indeed, we know that by 930 there was a true war in the Ukrainian countryside, and this added, I think, another significant dimension to the state's tasks besides revenues. The authorities had to pacify the peasants who rebelled against state violence and excessive grain confiscation with cheap and easily accessible alcohol. To be sure, the effects of its chronic consumption were broadly known. There is a number of studies about how alcohol, by the way, the studies that were conducted in the late 1920s and in the early 1930s, and these studies were quite popular about how alcohol influences people's mentality and so on, health. And the state knew this. Behavioral trends such as passivity, ambivalence toward authorities, and feelings of guilt were something worth perhaps developing to clinically achieve necessary goals of stabilizing the situation in Ukrainian villages. Many, of course, in the countryside deciphered the state's tactics on flooding the villages with cheap vodka and wrote letters of protest to the local and central authorities, which I read. Some identified these tactics as a deliberate attempt to starve people to death. Most of the petitioners were women and, surprisingly, children. The doctor Naberezhnaya, for instance, from Vovchansk, the Kharkiv Oblast, wrote a letter to the editing board of Moscow radio newspaper Proletariy. She demanded that the state should provide villages with at least one state store that would sell bread independently from cooperative stores. She's writing in this letter, instead, the state cares about interminable quantities of vodka in each village. One can buy vodka everywhere and cannot get bread anywhere, she bewailed. A remarkable socialist construction, she added sarcastically. So the question, I think, about whether the state's alcohol policy was intended to drag or to punish the rebellious Ukrainian peasantry for their resistance to collectivization seems to be, I think, legitimate, especially in light of substantial trail of archival documents from 1932-33 about the battle for sugar beets, for wheat and other important ingredients for alcohol production. I believe it singles out the naked fact that the intense expropriation of this produce in Ukraine for vodka production had a tremendous effect on the scale of the famine that struck the Ukrainian countryside in 1932-33. Now let me move to this topic of perhaps social responses or attitudes of various strata of the Ukrainian peasantry, children, women, men, and the elderly. I'll try to be brief, but I'll try to stay within the limit of my time today. There are children. There are two aspects I would like to briefly discuss here: the state's attitudes toward children and children's perception of the state. By the late 1920s, at the peak of the anti-nationalist campaign in Ukraine, the state's rhetoric altered, and the young generation in Ukraine, pioneers and Komsomol members, were divided across class and national lines. Homeless children, children of Kurkul origin, and children of parents who were arrested as Ukrainian nationalists were included in the category of so-called difficult children. They were often identified as recidivists, thieves, and socially neglected individuals, and local party bosses tended to employ a broadly accepted set of derogatory terms describing the antisocial behavior of children, terms actually which were usually applied to adults. And I would like you to pay attention to this particular, I wouldn't call this fact, but this is a document that I discovered in the State Archive of Kharkiv Oblast. You cannot read it without tears. I mean, similar terms were employed to depict 53 children from 3 months to 2 years of age who were placed in the orphanage in the village Andriivka, Balaklia district of the Kharkiv Oblast. This is a long, long report, by the way. I don't remember, 7 pages or something like that. Their origin and behavior were somewhat suspect to the state, and food supplies were denied to the dying babies. And we're talking about this year, 1933. Finally, in May 1933, the leaders of the Andriivskaya Selorada relented and asked Raivykonkom, the local party authorities, to help the nursery with food because for quite some time it had none to feed the babies. But they were nationalists, they were enemies and thieves and transgressors and so on. There are a lot of terms that they used in regards to these babies. By 1933, labeling children as enemies, thieves, nationalists, and Kurkuls rubbish. And I have to mention here that most documents are written, have been written in Russian. So they use this term over and over again, Kulatskaya otrебье. So in the press, they just love to do this, and it became a common, actually, phenomenon. The local party leaders and those who were in charge of these newspapers, they insisted that these children, whatever age, I mean, 10, 9, 13, 12, they have to be, if they committed some kind of crime, transgression, like зарезание колосків, for instance, stealing of wheat, they have to be tried as adults. I'm quoting here, one of these people are saying, they're not boys. They grew beards committing these crimes. They have to be tried in court as adults. The distrust between the authorities and village children seems to be mutual. Archival files preserved some voices of very young Soviet citizens who often characterized the Soviet regime as «чёртова радянская влада» and the like. Children also expressed their concerns in national terms, blaming the authorities for their starvation. The OGPO, the secret police, quickly found a solution for these difficult children. The most rebellious, who allowed themselves anti-Soviet critical remarks, were sent to kolhospy and radhospy to be used as slaves in a literal sense. I have another document, approximately a report of 10 pages, I think, to be used as slaves to repair the devastated agriculture in Ukrainian villages. These children were kept in a barn without windows, girls, boys laying on the floor, no food, no clothes. In the morning, off you go to the fields to work. Then they brought them back again. So it was just a terrible, terrible situation, and people finally who were in charge of this place, and by the way, these children were brought from orphanage there to be used as slaves. For the sake of time, I won't discuss many other themes linked to children, themes that I examine in my work, but I will just briefly mention that Taras Shevchenko's poems helped a few children survive the famine. I talked to one person at least who told me that she was a young person back then, and there is evidence for that in people's memoirs and testimonies. Another theme is cannibalism, of course, and children were victims of this phenomenon. For instance, according to the June 1933 report of the GPO, only in the Kharkiv Oblast, 221 cases of cannibalism were registered. Women, will try to be brief. The threat of punishment for the least transgressions, hard physical labor, and prolonged starvation hardened women in the countryside. And I got a sense reading these documents that many turned into very crude, vulgar, and masculine individuals, not all of them, but many of them. The brutality of those who were in charge of a search brigade or an office was documented in memoirs and archival materials. Many were using profanity of the worst kind that I read, while they communicated with anybody, I mean, including children, with men, women, and children during their search raids. And people complained about this. They wrote these letters about these incidents. They often received an equally aggressive response from other females, the owners of the property, assigned to be confiscated. And even threats of punishment, such as exile or imprisonment, didn't stop them from trying to save their last means of survival. The most courageous women using agricultural equipment prevented the lawless behavior of the activists. And we all remember, of course, this notorious order that emanated from the center. I think it was issued on the 7th of August, 1932, about the theft of state property. And cutting ears of wheat, зрезание колосков, from the колхоз fields was one of the most serious crimes among other transgressions. And often the death of women's first child from hunger pushed them to the fields to save other relatives. I would say, reading these documents, collective responses were often successful that came from women. Remember this term, Bobby Bund, Viola was writing about this. The very density, a mob of these women played a significant role in stopping the authorities' abuse. Individual women's responses often failed to achieve their goals. Moreover, they ran the risk of being beaten or raped by local party chiefs or Komsomol activists who were systematically drunk. I have a number of letters letters of complaint when women try to deliver their letters individually in the evening. And what they found, a drunk head of some kind of radhosp or kolhosp, and then she was raped. And then she was writing about this, complaining to central authorities. The number of suicides among women began to grow in 1928, reaching its peak in 1932-33. I also have evidence for that, documents. The village intelligentsia, especially female teachers, was especially vulnerable during the famine. Their salaries were understandably extremely low, and their access to foodstuffs was limited. As a result, they came to school suffering terribly from the consequences of malnutrition. Some fainted during class periods. For instance, in the Machabilivska school, Petrivsky district of the Kharkiv Oblast, the teacher Nosova, systematically hungry and exhausted, suffered from memory loss and often forgot what she had to do next in class. She was hungry and hardly alive, but this is normal. This is not unusual. What is unusual, the children and their parents filed an official complaint with her supervisors, who in turn submitted a secret report to the People's Commissariat of Education, yet in some sort of perverted form. The local authorities reported about low moral standards of these teachers in the countryside and their unethical behavior, which was in tune actually with the center's suspicion of and antipathy toward the intelligentsia. For most Ukrainian teachers in the countryside, the Soviet regime was associated with violence and coercion, and some openly discussed the state's rapacious methods of bread procurements with their students. The teacher Rybas from the village Lazavenki, near Kharkiv, consistently reflected her displeasure in the classroom about the way the state collectivized the peasants. This is a robbery, she repeatedly said. Told her students. She was secretly denounced by her colleagues to the People's Commissariat of Education, and her subsequent fate is unknown. The elderly is a huge topic. The only thing that I can say today is that they were the most vulnerable stratum of the peasantry, and judging from their letters of complaint, they were completely broken, physically, morally, intellectually. They ingratiated themselves with the authorities, begging for bread. Just shameless. I couldn't read it. But what can you do? It is clear from their texts that their spirit was enslaved, and slavery became a much easier solution for them than resistance. Men, also a big topic, but whom I would like to mention here and what aspect to discuss today also briefly, those who starved the least. Paradoxically, those in charge and who starved the least in the countryside, who were they? They, of course, were the heads of Sileradi or of some kind of unions and so on and so forth, party leaders, local party leaders, and they exhibited unprecedented cruelty, cynicism, and a lack of compassion toward those who were dying from hunger. In their cases, starvation was not the reason, of course, for the loss of moral orientation. And I think maybe further studies on the nature and effects, perhaps, of power on a human being's mentality are necessary to explain this phenomenon. The majority of the heads of kolkhozby, not all, but the majority, were not starving, as were the rest of the peasants. Some even had resources to arrange parties where the abundance of alcohol and food astonished the kolkhozbniki, and that's what they're writing in their letters. Some even organized a wedding, a drunken party, as it was characterized by the authorities. We're talking about February 1933. For instance, the head of the kolkhozb of the Zhukivska Silerada, his name was Luka Didenko. He was accused of failure to deliver sugar beets to storage facilities because instead of 55 horses that were available to him, he used only 6. Well, what happened with the rest of this horses? The rest were employed as a means of transportation for Didenko's guests who attended this wedding in October 1932. Corruption blossomed among those who had access to foodstuffs or other exchangeable assets such as animal stocks, granaries, tools, oil, kerosene, and the like. And their privileged status as heads of agricultural artillery and kolkhozby encouraged, unfortunately, them to steal. The majority failed to resist temptation, and the cases of conspiracy, corruption, fraud, theft, and manipulation of state property were quite typical. For instance, heads of the regional consumption units, what are they, these unions? They were established for distribution purposes of foodstuffs and served as administrative units that supervised the exchange of livestock and food reserves among villages and between the villages and the city. So they benefited from their pause. For instance, the head of the Valky Consumption Union regularly traveled to villages and took substantial quantity, and again, we're talking about the peak of the famine, 1933, February. He had regularly traveled to villages and took substantial quantities of agricultural products, and as it turned out, for personal needs. At the peak of the famine in February 1933, he went to the village Rezonenkovo, Valky district of the Kharkiv Oblast, and took from the producers 20 kilograms of honey. And then he routinely came back to get another 8, another 10, and so on. He took not only honey, sala, meat, bread, whatever they produced there. Chickens that were kept exclusively for breeding purposes were butchered, fried, and consumed by this person just right on the spot. So, of course, the peasants who were already swelling by this time, they were displeased, they wrote letters of complaint. Another person, Kasyanov, the guard of the granary of the Artil Peremoga, treated the facility as his own savings and borrowed grain from it when he felt like he was running short on bread in his family. However, there were more serious crimes than theft of state property that state officials, local state officials committed. Murder of the peasants was quite common. I have documents for that. For those who were well-fed and chronically drunk, living peasants were suspicious. At the peak of the famine, when in each village death from the famine claimed approximately, from 12 to 20 people daily. The plenipotentiary Parapov from the village Rogozyanka, Zolochiv district, was curious about where the villagers hid their resources. He just asked directly one person with irritation, "Where are you hiding this? Well, you're still alive. What are you feeding your children with? Where is your bread? Why are they still alive?" In his mind, he could not comprehend that those in whose bodies live barely smoldered consumed grass and tree bark by this time. Their concepts of food as a tool of survival dramatically differed, as well as their prospects for survival. For most peasants, they were dimming. For people like Potapov, they seemed to be more optimistic. Finally, a couple of words in conclusion. During the Holodomor, people chaotically tried to find an alternative to death, a means of survival, a solution which often fell into the space of immoral and antisocial behavior. By 1932-33, in the absence of hope, most surrendered, most, not all, surrendered their right to protest. Their discovery of the horror of quickly approaching death set them beyond hope and fear, submerging them in the raging sea of irrationality, pathology, and impossible choices. Soviet power left two alternatives for them: action and inaction, which as both were fraught with death. Erich Fromm has argued that among all threats to man's vital interests, the threat to his freedom is of extraordinary importance, individual and social. And moreover, Fromm was convinced that the desire and struggle for freedom are a natural biological reaction of human beings. The history of humankind has demonstrated that people fought for their freedom when there were prospects to win and when there were none. Only freedom provides people with an opportunity to develop morally, intellectually, physically, and they are willing to define their personal and often collective freedom from aggression and attempts to enslave it. The history of the Soviet man-made famine in Ukraine is a history of mass killings and subjugation, but I believe beyond that, the Holodomor was a powerful reinforcer of people's slave behavior and psychology, so necessary if the state was to implement its goals. As Maslow, that I mentioned earlier, reminded us, food as a vital biological interest of humans went first, freedom second, or last. The Holodomor cultivated a new Soviet man, uncertain of himself and submissive. People's cravings and struggle for freedom were replaced by the pathological fear of the authorities. They were uncertain of their past and future, and political passivity appears to have been a byproduct of this uncertainty. Also, I have to mention this here. There are signs of some sort of societal recovery, such as the Euromaidan. Of course, Shevchenko's poems were not a panacea from hunger. Also, they helped a few survive. Kobzar brought the dying to life by his ability to strengthen feelings of confidence, human dignity, and pride. He awakened the national moral and aesthetic spirit of the nation, or at least of some portion of it. And in retrospect, his image and his words seem to reappear at the most crucial moments in the Ukrainian history and continue to do so, granting warranties to the nation for the legitimacy of its existence. The Holodomor forced the Ukrainians to learn the art of survival. Approximately 15% of the population, for 15% of the population who are dead, who didn't survive this experience, it never became an art. Survival was merely a struggle with a lethal ending, and I'm asking myself a question all the time: can the Ukrainian learn something, if anything, from these particular experiences? In a state of constant political instability and chaos created by recurrent famines, repression, nuclear disasters, invasion, this is a very problematic task. My study attempts to analyze the patterns of people's verbal behavior and deeds, putting them in a historical context of the 1920s and 30s. And this is, I believe, in itself may have a heuristic value, and I think perhaps a moral value, because man-made famines challenge the belief about the most essential feature of humans, which distinguishes them from beasts. This is the principal moral foundation. Perhaps the examination of how people perceived their own personal experiences during the Holodomor helps us better understand the conflicted nature of a starving human being, the Ukrainian peasants' deformed collective life, and the disrupted life of a nation under the constant threat of death, a nation that still struggles to survive. And perhaps the Ukrainians, as this woman, remember that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, who pounded the rotten carrot, still are faced with multiple moral dilemmas and have to suffer in order to survive as a nation. Nevertheless, I believe sorting through these dilemmas invites people to crave, I would say, freshness and psychological rebirth, and reinforces their national pride and consciousness. Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, to what extent is the experience of the Kharkiv Oblast typical of the other regions of Ukraine? Did any such thing occur in non-Ukrainian areas? And the second is, you mentioned a lot about complaints being written to the authorities. Was there any response or reaction on the part of the authorities, or any indication of how they treated these complaints?
Thank you very much. The first question, probably I can speak only about some kind of typical phenomenon in other parts of Ukraine, only on the basis of what I read about it prior to this moment when I started my research. I would say that it's quite typical. I found a lot of parallels, of course. However, I found some documents that with some kind of narrative that I haven't seen or haven't read anywhere. And I provided some examples of this phenomenon. At the same time, I think, generally speaking, perhaps we can imagine what, or we cannot maybe imagine what a hunger or the famine can do to people. And I believe perhaps it would be true about all people. It doesn't matter what kind of geographic places they came from and where they experienced this famine or when they starved. And I believe they begin to kind of this moral degradation would be very obvious. Answering the first part of your question, I would say that I recalled that my father once told me that he almost died, but not during this famine of 1932-33, but in 1946, together with his mother. And when both of them were students of my mother and my father, when they were students of the Kyiv State University, he was asked by a person who was also a student in his group. He was asked, how was it? I mean, you were starving, you told us you almost died there. I can, for instance, I can try and perhaps I won't have food for 2 weeks. I can do this easily for 3 weeks, for 4, very easily. And what do you think? It wouldn't be. It was not so difficult for you. You maybe exaggerate this. And his answer was very simple. He said, I forgot her name, it's perhaps very simple, but you can starve yourself. You cannot touch the food knowing that this food is available for you. And you can go to your refrigerator or your cupboard and open and get it. We knew for sure that we're gonna die, and this contributed to this kind of mental state. Where he came from Smila. And he was not in Kharkiv. So, and it was not 1932-33. But my point is that the famine influences people in a certain way. And I would say that these human experiences are very similar. It doesn't matter where these people live. Another part of your question is about the reaction, right, of the authorities.
Non-Russian areas, non-Ukrainian areas. Non-Ukrainian areas.
Oh, non-Ukrainian area. You were asking about non-Ukrainian areas. I missed it a little bit.
Small pieces of
Yeah.
the Kharkiv Oblast that were settled by Russians, actually.
I have to study. I have to study these areas to make some kind of to be competent to answer your question, because people who make claims, usually I don't trust them because they have to be physically present in this particular area, go to this particular place, go to this particular archive, do their research, and then to make a comparative analysis. I think this would be fair then, to make some kind of assumption on my part, and probably I'm not ready to answer this particular question then if I didn't understand you about non-Ukrainian areas. I'm sorry. About the reaction of the authorities, I found only maybe 5 or 10 maximum letters of complaint that I could see some kind of trail. What happened after. Usually what they did in the archives, they collected these letters, and there are no responses. So they collect them, they just make a file out of them, and then some kind of historian comes and reads these files. And we don't know what happened with this particular person whose letter I read, and I don't know the end of it. I can guess that he said, my extremities, for instance, are swelling, and I don't have any food for a month, and I'm gonna die in 2 days if you're not gonna help. And apparently this person was gone, but there are no physical responses. Maybe I saw a couple of them, but they were actually, a check mark answer. Okay, we answered this person, fine. Some kind of formal response in terms of, we will just get back to you, that kind of responses. No more than that. That's what I found.
Hi, Marta Bazuk. I thought it was fascinating, your description of how Shevchenko might have functioned as a source of solace or comfort, or even something more in the survival of people. But I'm wondering, in your work, I think you mentioned 2 concrete examples here tonight. How many such cases have you come across, and if you could give us maybe another example, and where do these come up mostly? In oral in written memoirs, or in other kinds of documents?
Thank you very much, Marta. There are 2 sources that this particular issue is raised. First is letters of complaint, and the second proclamations. And I saw the originals, meaning it just something illegal that was distributed, and people called. We don't know who they are, because we don't know who wrote them. However, we see these originals, so they were distributed all over maybe the village, because we also don't know where they were distributed. They're in this particular file, but I'm not sure where the authorities found these particular proclamations. So answering your question, 2 sources. How many? Approximately maybe 50, 60 letters of of complaints and proclamations, maybe 7, 10. Not much, but still it's sufficient to understand. For some people, Shevchenko was someone who saved them. And I talked to 2 people who mentioned that they had Kobzar personally. I knew these people, they're not around. I thought that we have to write about it, because to ignore this fact, it should be investigated further, for sure. But to ignore this fact, it would be just incorrect. Thank you.
And I'll take a chance at that question. When one reads survivor testimony, one more frequently comes up with what might be called heroic or self-sacrificing stories. That is, we survived because my mother did this and this. My father went off to the city to get the bread and dies on the way back. And of course, our problem today is to know how these narratives are constructed. That is, these are people who survived, came into largely another world, the ones who came here to the West. Or I would assume when we're going to look at these 1989 Silski Vista, we have all the Manyak things, we may get more of this. So then the question comes about, was this, I realize you cannot, on the basis of what you've done, say frequency. But of course, it doesn't enter into the story that you have given us today. And do you think it's just missing in your sources, or do you think it is probably exaggerated in what survivors tell later because they need to have this, or where would you place that then?
It's a very good question, Dr. Sisson, thank you. And we have to think about then how memoirs are being written, right? Or how people recall this event. Perhaps they might exaggerate, they don't recall very accurately the events, all kinds of problems can be, there. But however, I think my method, that's how I call it, is just cross-reading. If I encounter some kind of interesting detail and some kind of memoirs, and of course we cannot trust immediately this person because we don't know his, for instance, individual history, who this person was. So this cross-reading, it's a very helpful method. And if I discover some interesting detail in some letter of complaint, for instance, I go somewhere else if it's possible, and I check in some other sources to verify if he's telling the truth. And this person sometimes can be caught lying. So there are a lot of things that you can check the dates, the facts in some other sources, and then to make some kind of conclusion about the reliability of this source, if you will. But this is a great, by the way, problem with the sources, and I think we have to be very cautious with all sources when we read archival documents, memoirs, or narratives, or even when you talk to a person. A lot of factors are in place, so I'm afraid that you cannot take everything face value, of course. Yes.
When you were studying these events, have you come across any scientific studies from the point of view of genetic inherited characteristic to a survival of any individuals? If not, might be very interesting for somebody to pick up on this issue and seriously study it from that point of view, because there sure is enough information about the survival from your stories alone to draw conclusions as to why and how come certain individuals survived and others just gave up, or turned into immoral animal beings, carnivores and all of that sort of thing?
I think Maslow talks a lot about this, and Peter M. Sorokin discussed this particular theme. But, however, I didn't go that far to study some kind of genetic base, maybe. But it's a very good idea. At the same time, I'm not sure how I would interweave this into this particular topic, because then it should be a purely medical study, which possibly I can do because I'm a doctor by training. I could have done this probably previously, or maybe not. It's very difficult to say, but it's an interesting topic. However, I think it's a medical perspective.
Nobody tried.
And I that deeply no.
Oh, but how unfortunate. Because I think that in the future, we will need information like that, considering what's happening in the whole world. And it would be a good idea for us to start studying who will end up surviving.
There are a lot of factors, as we know.
You mentioned, I imagine, Abraham Maslow. So has studying his methodology, has that prompted you to look into comparative psychology in terms of survival of the Holocaust, and say, for instance, also survival of the famines of the Great Leap Forward, that kind of thing? And to a certain extent, I wanted to return to the scientific aspect. Was did Soviet psychiatry study the prevalence of psychological pathologies in the countryside and the cities comparatively?
I know that these studies of psychiatric studies and psychological studies kind of again rejuvenated in the 1920s. However, in the 1930s, when Stalin took over, unfortunately, the studies were supposed to be done from some kind of Marxist perspective, and everything went down the you know where, yes. And however, I studied the Soviet approach, psychiatric approach, or approach to this discipline or branch of medicine, psychiatry. But I studied this during a little bit the later period, in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And that's why I wrote an essay about psychiatric abuse or political psychiatry or punitive psychiatry that was a common phenomenon in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and even in the before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were still doing this, putting people in psychiatric clinics for transgressions, ideological transgressions. I'm more familiar with this particular topic because I studied it during this later period. But it's an interesting question, and I will look into this. Thank you very much.
In all references to the Holodomor, the term peasants is always used. From my view and the general North American view, and for that matter, the world view, this is a derogatory term. Like, in other words, it's not quite subhuman, but it's not quite fully human. And the use of it conveys in the minds of many people the feeling that these sacrifices, these murders, were not justified, but tending in that particular direction. So my question is, people like yourself and other people who are here who have studied the Holodomor, have they considered using a different term, say something like just simply farmers, as opposed to this, what I feel is a very derogatory term?
Which one, Martin?
Peasants.
Peasants, okay. I don't know how to answer this question because I didn't feel that I didn't feel the same way as you do when I use the term the peasantry. It's just the identification of some kind of social.
No, it's not directed to you. I'm just saying.
Yeah. I understand. But
And in North American culture, the understanding of that word is not. It is derogatory.
okay, but
I don't know whether you're aware of that, but or maybe nobody's ever thought that. But every time that I see that word, it bothers me, and I know it bothers a lot of people.
farmers is more elegant. That's what.
Not more elegant, no.
That's what they do. Actually, that's what identifies them as what they do for living and so on. But
Yeah, but you're farmers.
they.
You don't get my point.
Yeah, the only thing, what I would say is obviously, yes, does peasant in some contexts in English, have negative connotations, as it does in many other languages as well. The general divides are, of course, farmers are usually thought to be people who lived on a farmstead, not people who lived in a village and then went out to have collective fields. So when you talk about France, you always talk about the peasantry in France. That is, North America had a different structure. And the other thing I'll say, and this is a tangential one, but it's also the creation of categories and terms. Very interesting is the creation of the word "selyan" in Ukrainian. Right? What happened was in the 19th century, the Ukrainian movement and language decided to talk positively about this group. And so in Western Ukraine, where in 1848 you would have called them chłopy, Polish negative. Selana is created, it could be the equivalent of villagers in a certain way, but of course in the Ukrainian movement, Selyanska has generally a positive connotation. That is, one society views a sort of society negative and another positive. But yeah, there are problems with connotations, I agree.
Andrei Makhuk. I've got, I guess, two questions. One is what sort of response you may or may not have seen regarding the question of theft and also vigilantism against this sort of activities, people taking the law into their own hands, and I guess the legal repercussions. And the question of whether the process by which people engaging in cannibalism would have been brought to the authorities' attention.
Cannibalism. First, what I would like to say about this particular phenomenon, I'm still in the process of investigating this topic because it's incredibly difficult, by the way, to find, first of all, any sources on this phenomenon. Then not much has been written about this, and I'm trying still to go to the archives and to find any mention on this particular phenomenon. But it's incredibly difficult to write about this because I don't feel that any source that I find, for instance, will serve as evidence. And I always question my sources, and still he says, she says, and it's very difficult to identify what is true, where should you go, what to believe, and so on and so forth. But I'm trying my best to touch upon the most difficult questions in the context of this particular event, the Holodomor. And still I am uncertain of myself, of my maybe expertise and so on, but I'm trying my best to find answers to these particular questions also. Thank you.
Were your studies only concentrated on Kharkiv, or did you study this phenomenon in like Poltava area, which is also farming, heavily farming area?
No, I actually read all literature that has been written, everything that has been written about the Holodomor, but I would like to still focus on the Kharkiv Oblast, because this is the place that interests me the most, and I would like to understand what is the dynamics was actually there, because it's my home city, Kharkiv, and the Kharkiv Oblast. I would like to know the trends, the patterns, and perhaps if I complete this study, I would like maybe to provide people with more information, with more data, and then they will build on this. They will do some sort of comparative studies, comparing. Someone focuses on Poltava, for instance. And for them, it would be incredibly helpful if they have some study about the Kharkiv Oblast, and then we can compare me or someone else or future scholars. So we have to focus first on some kind of areas, regions, and then go from there.
This will be our last question.
But not Poltava, no, the Kharkiv Oblast.
Viktor Ostapchuk. I have a very simple question. Much has been made in this in the study of the famine of the border. Control of the border being sealed off between RSFSR and Ukrainian Republic. Did you find any evidence of this or any nuances on this issue?
Only some documents not in the State Archive of Kharkiv Oblast, but in Zdacho, which is the State Archive of Civil Organizations in Kyiv. And there are also letters of complaint. They are talking about how they travel to Kursk or to Belgorod, which is not so far from Kharkiv. We're talking about 20, 30, I think, or 50 miles, and they saw all kinds of foods there, foodstuffs, everything. They had fruit, they had meat, so people lived normal lives. So this kind of sources, yeah, I saw these letters, not much. But somehow people got out. How they penetrated this particular area, because today we know that the GPO detachments, they created some kind of, it was just a kind of the border, right, which you couldn't cross. Some people made it. They escaped and they saw a better life there. So we know what was happening, but this particular sources came from, I didn't see anything like this in the state.
There was a contrast difference, but there was some permeability to the border.
Yes, of course. The borders were porous, of course, but a lot of people died, we know, trying to escape, and they were shot in the back. But these documents that I'm talking about, they came from Zdacho, from Kyiv. And if I want to apply these documents to my particular study or to talk about them, then it will be just about maybe those who came from Kyiv, from Kyivska Oblast, and I didn't know how to integrate this particular material into my study about the Kharkiv Oblast.
Maybe what I'd say before we conclude, and you'll have a chance to talk privately with Dr. Bertelsen, when the research went on in the 1970s, particularly 1980s, the famine as it became the Holodomor, the argument was always made that how can you be serious, you don't have archives. We remember this well. How can you base yourself on emigre survivor testimony? And that presented a great problem for study of the Ukrainian famine in those days. We've had over 20 some years, 25, 6, in which the archives have been opened. I wish we could say we had had many studies based on archives that had expanded. I think regrettably in Ukraine that field did not develop in the way we might have hoped initially. It now develops more, and we have hopes that more will do it. But I think what we heard today is that the fear that, and I think many assume, well, the Germans wrote down everything, but the Soviets probably didn't, or you can't depend on their material or whatever, has been shown that there is a great deal of material within Soviet archives. There's been a great deal of destruction as well, I grant, and of certain of those archival materials that it takes a seasoned and sensitive researcher to use that material. And what we really heard today was a tour de force, that is a discussion that took into account both theories of famine and what famine does, applied it to Ukraine in ways that maybe sometimes hurts us to hear when we think what Ukrainians were subjected to, and in some ways in the horror of hunger, what this brought to them. But it's the only way I think we can really bring the study of the Holodomor into general discussions of famine studies, into discussions of perpetration, into discussions of the Soviet regime and what the Soviet regime did, and in a certain way into discussions of what it has done to Ukrainian society in this post-genocide society that James Mace has told us about. We're grateful to Dr. Bertelsen for having conducted that difficult research and for interpreting it so well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.